May 8, 1945. Above a devastated Germany where the war was over but the world still didn't know how to breathe again, the stench of gunpowder still hung in the air. Streets that had previously been filled with marching boots now lay silent under snow and rubble. In the ruins of her apartment in Munich, a woman named Liesel bent over a broken sink and washed the soot from her face with melted snow. Her hands trembled as she washed away the dust of subjugation. She was 23 and emaciated from hunger. The first American jeeps rolled down Sonnenstrasse, their olive-green paintwork shining like a strange skin against the gray backdrop of defeat. All her life she had been told that Americans were evil people, who tortured, burned, and enslaved others. But then she saw a boy in uniform, barely older than her brother, who had died in Kursk, who stopped to give chocolate to a barefoot child as she looked through the broken window frame. The same scene was repeated in Hesse and Bavaria. Tanks stood next to breadless bakeries and chuckled in the same alleys where artillery had roared just a few weeks earlier. The only thing left of Germany was terror. The incessant hammering of certainty had disappeared from the Nazi radios. Now whispered warnings that the Americans were on their way and would hold the Germans to account replaced the orders. The first days, however, were marked more by curiosity than harshness, more by questions than executions. Some GIs asked for directions, some exchanged cigarettes for a photo of a family that had disappeared. Under a tattered Red Cross banner, women stood in long lines outside the camp for displaced persons outside Frankfurt, waiting for bread. Their faces showed incredulous amazement and longing. A young U.S. soldier stood next to them, handing out cans of corned beef, grinning nervously as the women muttered thank you in broken English. He was a 21-year-old farm boy from Kansas named James O'Donnell. Before he saw Berlin, he had never seen a building taller than his barn. When he looked into the faces of the defeated, he saw not enemies, but an echo of his own sisters back home. That day, Liesel was one of the people who stepped forward and held up her food ration card as if in confession. She averted her gaze from him, but something inside her calmed as he spoke slowly, quietly, and without command. That April, there was a strange silence in the air. It was the silence of those who had endured everything except hope. German women with patched skirts and paper-thin faces emerged from the cellars of small towns. They stared at the strange, self-assured warriors holding rifles in one hand and soap in the other. Against the backdrop of devastation, the Americans' jokes, harmonica playing, and distribution of chewing gum to the children seemed almost immoral. All these gestures were contradictory. How could such smiles remain on the faces of men who had destroyed cities? For months, they watched each other across invisible boundaries. They ordered the Americans not to mix with the population. The Germans were instructed to comply. But as loneliness and hunger grew louder, the instructions were increasingly forgotten. One evening, as rain poured through the broken windows of a residential building in Dresden, an American knocked on Liesel's door. He wasn't looking for collaborators or illegal goods. He just wanted to know if there was a stove nearby where he could heat up his food. She hesitated, remembering all the posters that had warned her, the hideous faces, the caricatures. But his clothes were wet and his eyes were tired. She opened the door for him. He brought her some black, bitter, warm coffee from a tin can. It had been 3 years since she last drank coffee. Although they couldn't communicate in a common language, they understood each other better than words could express. Rain pelted against the broken glass outside, replacing the sound of artillery. She briefly lost track of who had won and who had lost. She stared at the small piece of chocolate he had given her as if it were gold. Other women in other places experienced the same change in unrest. A smile was worth a loaf of bread in Nuremberg. Another woman took in an injured GI in Cologne after he fell out of his jeep. Silently, compassion spread under the pretext of necessity. However, this was accompanied by rumors from residents, the occupying forces, and the ghost of the Reich that continued to haunt them. Was this betrayal or forgiveness? Could a heart marked by hatred be re-educated so quickly to become tender again? The Americans were just as uncertain. Many of them had lost friends in Normandy or the Ardennes, and now they were helping those who had been told they were incorrigible. They were shocked to see exhausted mothers, hungry children, and women who flinched at every loud noise instead of proud Nazis. The enemy seemed to be just human after all. The tone of letters home began to change, becoming more compassionate and less triumphant. One of the GIs wrote to his mother, "They look like us. They've just lost too much." By the end of the summer, flowers began to bloom among the ruins. Amid the rubble, civilians rebuilt marketplaces, and laughter could be heard here and there again. Still not allowed to mingle with the people, the Americans found excuses to stay near the towns. They taught children how to play baseball, repaired roofs, and distributed canned peaches. Liesl worked in a small field kitchen, stirring watery soup for the Allied forces patrolling nearby and for the German residents. James often stopped by and traded his soldiers' bread for stories he wanted to hear but couldn't understand. Although their words were awkward, they learned grammar from each other through their glances. Once, using gestures, she asked him why he wasn't angry and why he didn't despise her for what her country had done. She understood the tone, but not the words, when he shrugged and slowly added, "The war is over." For the first time, she thought that peace might mean more than just giving up. With the onset of autumn, the first rumors began to circulate about American soldiers marrying German women. It seemed almost grotesque and unimaginable. Marrying the enemy. In Bavaria, however, a GI wrote a letter to obtain permission to marry a girl from Frankfurt. On the back of a photo of a man in uniform, given to a young woman in another place, were 3 words: friend, not foe. Unsure of how the world would unfold, Liesl carried her doubts and her ration card through another chilly morning. The scent of bread wafted from the still-smoking ruins. James raised his hand in greeting across the camp and climbed into his jeep. With a shy, uncertain gesture that meant more than any salute, she raised her hand as well. In 1945, Germany had fallen from grace, but something inexplicable rose again from the rubble. People, not flags or states. Silence had fallen over the war, but 2 adversaries had begun to talk to each other in that silence. At the time, they had no idea that the words they were learning, bread, coffee, and home, would soon change the very definition of success. In the weeks that followed, Germany was transformed into a place of strange contrasts, where friendliness and defeat existed side by side on the same street. Still reeking of smoke, American jeeps roared into the city, their drivers handing out chocolate bars to children who had forgotten what laughter sounded like. For Liesl and other women, survival had meant endurance, obedience, and silence. Now, however, the silence was broken as the crackle of American radios, the hum of generators, and the strange rhythm of swing music coming through broken windows took its place. Every morning she worked in the field kitchen, stirring thin soup next to containers marked with white stars, while the men in khaki, half boys, half soldiers from distant lands, waited in line for their rations. Every day, Private James O'Donnell returned, his boots muddy, his smile effortless, as if he had never been taught what hatred should look like. Sometimes he brought small gifts, such as a bar of soap, a pair of old gloves, or even a precious piece of chocolate carefully wrapped in paper. He would reply hesitantly, "For you," and then hint that she should hide it from others. After all, fraternization was against the law. Unlike weapons, kindness spread quietly and silently. Every gesture was a crime of compassion. No American soldier was allowed to have inappropriate contact with Germans, as stated in Circular No. 155 of the War Department. But orders alone do not make troops. They were driven by loneliness, curiosity, and a desperate desire to rediscover their humanity. Amid the chaos of occupation, Liesl's eyes, cautious but lively, seemed like a stabilizing force. Although he had crossed rivers under fire and attacked communities, this quiet woman cooking soup amid the ruins frightened him even more. He returned every day, sometimes to help her lift the heavy pots, sometimes just to listen to her hum an old lullaby that helped him forget the sound of gunfire, even though every word they exchanged was punishable by law. Rumors circulated in the camp. A sergeant had been caught giving nylon stockings to a German woman. Another was charged with inappropriate behavior after giving a patrolman a long smile. Although Liesl avoided contact with the public, the line between longing and survival became blurred with each passing day. One evening, James helped her cover the goods with tarps when rain began to drip through the holes in the kitchen roof. The light touch of his sleeve on her hand was like a spark in an otherwise ash-soaked universe. He nodded, but stood motionless as she murmured, "You should go." They stood there in silence, their breath clearly visible in the cold. Similar stories were told behind closed cellar doors and curtains in occupied Germany. Under military supervision, the cafes reopened, but it was the Americans who gave the German waitresses extra sugar. Half in jest, half out of longing, the women called them Schokoladsoldaten, or chocolate soldiers. No one overlooked the irony. The defeated were starving, and the victors had plenty. But food and favors were never the only topics of conversation. After years of cruelty, it was about relearning what tenderness felt like. Liesl was warned by her friend Marta, a widow whose husband had died in Russia, to stay away from her. She said, "When the order comes, they will leave. And the only thing that will remain of you is shame." The enemy of shame was familiar. Since the surrender, it had found its way into every German household. This time, however, Liesl saw a muted rebellion growing beneath it. When they met again, She told James with gestures and bits of English that as a girl she had dreamed of America, the land of movies, jazz, and freedom. With a quiet laugh, he took a folded magazine out of his jacket and pointed to an advertisement showing a happy woman with a Coca-Cola bottle. "That's not entirely true," he said. "But the smile is real." The days grew longer. The Americans built new barracks. The Germans rebuilt both their pride and their walls. At night, distant dance tunes by Glenn Miller, Ella Fitzgerald, and Benny Goodman drifted out of the soldiers' recreation tents. Sometimes the German women listened in the dark, moving silently to music they couldn't understand but could feel because the rhythms penetrated the cold. One evening, James appeared near the kitchen with a small portable radio. He tuned it until the static subsided, placed it on the counter, and let a melody float between them. For the first time, he heard her giggle, and the ruins outside seemed almost beautiful for a brief moment. Still, the danger remained. One afternoon, an American lieutenant overheard their conversation and summoned James to headquarters. Liesl wondered if mercy had its limits as she waited in her tiny chamber that night, looking down at the deserted street. "You warned me," was all he said when he returned 2 days later, his eyes swollen with pride. "Won't you come anymore?" she asked. He shook his head. "No." That was as close to a confession as either of them could get. Stories like theirs were repeated elsewhere. When reality set in at the end of 1946, the prohibitions on fraternization began to fade. Hearts could not be rationed, the commanders knew. The daughter of a former ridiculed officer married a soldier in Vauban. In Hamburg, a nurse who had previously treated a GI for frostbite married him. Headlines such as, "Americans marry German brides," were printed in local newspapers, with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Editors received a flood of letters. Some were moved, others outraged. "I fought in the war so that people could choose whom they love, not whom they hate," wrote one soldier. Liesl and James managed to keep their secret in small ways. He taught her 3 words: tomorrow, home, and coffee. She taught him to trace letters in the dust on the counter and to be free and peaceful. She paused and remembered Marta's warnings when he offered her a pair of nylon stockings from army surplus. However, it was not a gift out of vanity. It had to do with honor. Something fresh and soft on her skin felt like permission to be human again in a world where everything had been taken from her. One evening, as the last snow began to melt, James told her that he would soon be transferred to Bremen. The words fell between them like broken glass. She tried to appear unimpressed, nodded, but her throat hurt. While searching for his notebook, he replied, "Maybe I'll write." She smiled slightly. "Maybe hearts can cross oceans if letters can," she said. Both wanted to believe such things, but neither did. The evening before his departure, he came into the kitchen one last time. The room smelled of ash and rain, and the fires had gone out. He gave her a package wrapped in paper. It contained a photo of him with his dog by his side, in front of a farmhouse in Kansas, surrounded by knee-deep snow. On the back he had scribbled, She stared at it for a while before reaching into her apron pocket and giving him a single pressed flower, the only thing she had kept since before the war, because kindness exists even when you forget it. He took it, their fingers touched. Neither of them said anything. His convoy left the camp at dawn. As the trucks disappeared into the surrounding fog, she stood at the window, holding the photo to her chest. With its citizens carrying buckets of bread, drinks, and memories, Germany came back to life. Even after the conflict ended, its aftermath continued to shake every human interaction. James looked back once, but there was nothing left to see, somewhere on the road ahead of him. That same spring, the first rumors of war brides began to surface, including stories of women boarding ships and taking vows under foreign flags. To Liesl, it was just a fable, a fantasy too fragile to be true. But in her heart, she understood that love had a will of its own once it was awakened. The Americans had come as conquerors. Now, unwittingly, they had set in motion a riskier process, the rebuilding of hearts. Although the war had ended a year earlier, in 1946, the world was still figuring out what peace meant. The ruins of Germany whispered, but they no longer smoked. In this precarious silence, letters began to cross the Atlantic, brown envelopes with foreign stamps and messages that contained a subtle hint of hope and coffee. Some were written by American soldiers who couldn't forget the women they had met in the rubble. Others were written by German women who dared to believe that kindness did indeed exist. Liesl took a risk with every word she wrote. She began with the words, "The air is cold here again." Your picture, however, makes winter seem smaller. When the postman delivered a reply weeks later, she briefly experienced the impossibility of the distance of war becoming more tangible. James wrote a short letter. He wrote that while working with a transport unit at his former post in Bremen, he had often thought of her flour-stained hands in the field kitchen and her humming as she stirred. He wrote, "If there is a God, he must have wanted our paths to cross." In peacetime, such a sentence would have been laughed at, but after 6 years of misery, sincerity had become a kind of rebellion. They corresponded with each other through the Army Postal Service, their words escaping the censors, who had no interest in love stories. There were rumors that the U.S. would allow soldiers to marry foreign women. The news seemed ridiculous, like another miracle from the newspaper. Nevertheless, the War Brides Act, passed by Congress in December 1945, allowed American soldiers to bring their foreign wives home. Soon after, it was amended to include Japanese and German women, who were once enemies, but are now, surprisingly, potential wives. It was a bureaucratic footnote in the newspapers. It was the sound of hearts opening in the cities and camps of occupied Germany. "Would you come to America?" was the first question Liesl wrote in shaky handwriting. She read it as the outside world was covered in snow and lit by a dim light bulb. Leaving meant both exile and safety. Getting married meant entering a life she couldn't understand or describe. She had lost her home, her family, and the pride of her country. But it was worth the chance to be part of a group of people who saw her as a human being, and not as a German. She wasn't sure if it was love or surrender when she finally wrote yes back. The formalities were brutal: background checks, interrogations, and dozens of forms. Every potential bride had to prove she wasn't a Nazi sympathizer, sick, or dishonest. American officials scrutinized them as carefully as they had once scrutinized weapons. But behind the icy bureaucracy lay a human story. Despite the laughter of his superiors, James continued to submit applications. "Would you like to marry a German?" One captain scoffed. "Are you sure you can remember the last 4 years?" But he remembered every starving child and every destroyed house. And that was exactly why he wanted a new start. The first ships bringing German war brides to America arrived in the spring of 1947. Many of the women joked that the name Operation War Bride sounded more like a military expedition than a wedding. In Bremerhaven, Liesl boarded one of these ships with a photo of James and a piece of luggage in her hand. Hundreds of women gathered around her, their voices mingling with the sound of the waves as they prayed or cried quietly. Some held babies in their arms whose fathers were soldiers already waiting across the border. None of them had any doubts about the people who had once lived in their towns. The German coast, a place of ghosts, disappeared behind the fog as the ship finally left the harbor. The days at sea blurred together. The women laughed too loudly for a ship with so many secrets and told stories in terrible English. Liesl befriended Hilda, a young woman who had married a mechanic from Ohio. Hilda claimed to have heard that milk was delivered to homes in glass bottles and that even the poor in America had refrigerators. One evening she said, "They say there's no rubble there." Can you imagine that? Liesl couldn't imagine it. Instead, she dreamed of Kansas with its endless wheat fields and peaceful mornings without air raid sirens. The air became clear, electric, and full of hope as the ship approached New York Harbor. When the Statue of Liberty appeared, its flame glistening in the morning mist, the women gathered on the deck. For many, it was their first glimpse of America. For some, it was their first glimpse of independence. Liesl clung to the railing and cried secretly. She had expected to feel fear or shame. Instead, she was incredulous. Soldiers in pressed uniforms, holding flowers instead of weapons, waited below on the piers. Some smiled like schoolboys, others were nervous. As the women disembarked, James stood among them, looking at each face. He froze when he finally saw Liesl, her coat buttoned up to her neck, pale from the journey. She was the only one who walked down the ramp with trembling hands as the noise in the harbor subsided. Unsure what to do, he took a step forward and simply reached out his arm. She slipped her arm through his. Words were unnecessary. Surrounded by a few other couples who had made the same unlikely journey, they were married that afternoon in a modest military chapel near the harbor. The chaplain recited the vows with a thin smile, exhausted from a dozen weddings that week. Almost as an afterthought, he continued, "You may kiss the bride." The fact that no one was afraid anymore made the event seem unreal to Liesl, not because of the kiss. A rented room above a bakery in Brooklyn served as their first home. With neon signs, rumbling subways beneath them, and storefronts bursting with abundance she could hardly comprehend, the city overwhelmed her. When she saw a washing machine for the first time, she cried, not with happiness but with exhaustion at the thought that even doing laundry could be easy in this place. Her neighbors were polite but curious. Some murmured behind their curtains, some brought casseroles. Everyone still remembered the conflict, but friendliness spread like wildfire. From letters from Germany, she learned that not all stories had such a happy ending. Families who could not forgive rejected some brides. Others were viewed with suspicion by both sides, as traitors to one nation and reminders of the other's guilt. But for every tragedy, there were 100 small miracles. German middle names and English lullabies were used for newborns. Christmas trees were lit in homes that once feared power outages. With peanut butter and promises instead of punishment, America had assimilated its former enemies. One evening, she was baking bread in her small kitchen when James came home early with a letter from a comrade still serving overseas. "Now they call you war brides," he grinned. She laughed softly. "It sounds like we had to fight for our wedding." After looking at her briefly, he nodded. "Maybe you did." Later, as they stood on the balcony watching the snow fall over the rooftops, Liesl asked, "Do they still hate us?" He thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said. "They're just shocked at how things have turned out." As she rested her head on his shoulder, she thought about the devastation she had caused and the faces that would never understand. Then she realized that survival wasn't the biggest shock of all. It was forgiveness. She was welcomed by the same country that had previously dropped bombs on her home. History had demanded revenge, but love had made a different decision. The ships had not only brought brides, they had brought proof that compassion could spread further than hatred. But even as she slept that night, a subtle unease remained, a hint of exile and belonging intertwined. The next day, she would wake up in America, where everyone was happy and the streets were clean. However, to determine whether generosity could endure beyond memory, part of her would always remain in that harbor, halfway between the ruins and the dream. By 1950, America had recovered from the war. However, the people who had experienced the conflict had not forgotten it. The fighters returned to their factories and fields. By learning new phrases, new recipes, and new dreams, the women who had survived the rubble tried to block out the sound of the bombs. Behind white picket fences and brand new Chevrolets, a quiet miracle was taking place in Midwestern neighborhoods. German dialects mingled with American laughter. The newspapers no longer referred to them as enemies. They were simply citizens, mothers, and neighbors. They were simply citizens, mothers, and neighbors. But in kitchens like Liesl's, beneath the silence of everyday life, the past continued to burn like an unquenchable ember. They had moved from their apartment in Brooklyn to a modest house in Kansas, near James's family farm. There, the horizon stretched further than she had ever seen, and the soil was rich and dark. At first, she was unsettled by the great quiet of the place, where there were no sirens and no debris. The town seemed polite, but uncertain. Sometimes people smiled too quickly. When she spoke, children whispered. As she had learned during the occupation, Liesl smiled and praised the grocer's wife when she added, "For one of those, you speak English well." Peace had its own rules of survival. James transported grain for days on end. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the fireflies hovering over the wheat. He occasionally mentioned the war, but not too often. The sounds of everyday life had replaced the nightmares, including her humming in the kitchen, the creaking of the rocking chair, and the crying of their newborn daughter Emma. When the baby was born, the town became less curious. Gifts arrived, including a small Bible, casseroles, and blankets. It seemed as if forgiveness could wear an apron. However, not all doors opened. An elderly man refused to shake her hand during a veterans' dinner hosted by the local church. With sad eyes, he replied, "My brother died there." She wanted to tell him that she had also lost her brother, but the words stuck in her throat because this loss had no flag and no language. Later, James found her sobbing in the kitchen. He whispered softly, "He doesn't know you." She nodded. "No," she whispered, "but he knows enough." Eventually, she adapted to the rhythm of American life. She learned to say howdy instead of hello and to bake cakes instead of strudel. She discovered that neighbors gossiped when you weren't feeling well and brought gifts when you were doing well. Children, she realized, asked questions without malice. When Emma started school, she brought home a crayon drawing of two flags. On one side were stars and stripes, on the other a red cross, which she claimed was Mama's old flag. Liesl cried as she smiled. Before the world had ended its conflicts, the child had drawn a truce. Germany sent letters less frequently now. Marta once wrote about the reconstruction of her community with American aid. She wrote, "They say the soldiers give the children candy." The end of the world seemed to have been only the beginning. James smiled slightly as Liesl read the letter to him. He remarked, "I think we were both lucky. You got chocolate. I understand you." In 1952, she took the oath of allegiance to the United States before a federal official. Her voice faltered as she renounced her country of birth. But after she finished, she felt a sense of belonging, something she hadn't experienced in years. James held her hand in front of the courthouse. He declared, "You're one of us now." "I always have been," she said quietly, looking at him. That evening, they had roast chicken and apple pie for dinner, but she smuggled a little piece of home into her new life by adding boiled potatoes and parsley. According to later historians, over 14,000 German war brides became citizens of the United States during those years. To the rest of the world, it was a statistic. In the eyes of the women, it was a resurrection. They connected the victorious and defeated nations, creating a new lifestyle out of contradictions. They taught their children that identity can be more delicate than memory and more sensitive than politics. Small reminders of this fusion were scattered throughout Liesel's home. A cuckoo clock ticked above a photo of James in uniform. Next to a nativity scene carved from German wood stood a Christmas tree decorated with paper stars. From the past was the only place she could name without hesitation when neighbors asked her about her origins. The years passed in silence. With her father's laughter and her mother's eyes, Emma grew into a curious, freckled young woman. Neither of them could easily answer her questions. "Grandpa, was he a Nazi? Did you love your father when you were enemies?" Bit by bit, Liesel revealed the truth to her. When love strikes, it doesn't ask for permission, and sometimes people get caught up in storms they didn't cause. James still called her the bravest woman he knew on summer evenings when the air was heavy with the scent of rain and wheat. "No, just the hungriest," she replied with a smile, and they both understood that she meant hunger for mercy rather than food. However, the story never really ended. In 1955, a documentary film crew visited Kansas to talk to veterans about the impact of the war. James hesitated when they asked if they could film his family. "Are you sure?" she teased. "Are you afraid they'll find out you married the enemy?" He smiled. "I married the future." Throughout the interview, the reporter asked Liesel for her current opinion of America. She hesitated and chose her words carefully. "It's strange," she murmured softly. "I came here as an enemy, but from everyone I meet, I learn that forgiveness is more powerful than triumph." Perhaps embarrassed by how quiet the reality was, the cameraman hung his head. Months later, when the program aired, neighbors approached her on the street. Once she received a jar of honey from an elderly man who had previously refused to shake her hand. He said, "My brother would have liked you." Liesel shed another tear that evening, but this time it was a beautiful tear. Decades later, she looked back and recognized the pattern. Where conflicts had once burned, compassion had taken root like a seed. The same story was repeated across the country. Thousands of women like her planted gardens, baked bread, and raised children who had never learned to hate. Instead of disappearing, the past softened and became more and more integrated into everyday life. One autumn afternoon, Liesel stood at the edge of her garden and watched Emma chase fireflies after years of quiet work and laughter. James, now older, sat beside her, his hands calm but rough. For a brief moment, she felt the full weight of her journey, from rubble to porchlight, from enemy to wife, from fear to family, as the sky burned with the gold of harvest. "It was all a kind of grace, wasn't it?" she whispered softly as she turned to him. He nodded. "The kind we never deserved, but the greatest kind." In the distance, a church bell tolled, more a sign of evening than of victory or surrender, and the wind carried the scent of apples and earth. Liesel said a prayer as the noise subsided, not to forget the war, but to remember how it had ended. For some, borders and treaties were the source of peace. For others, it was smaller things like a cup of coffee shared between strangers, a letter sent around the world, or a child born to two former rivals who now considered the same nation their home. The world had learned from war how to destroy, but it had also learned how to regenerate through love, through quiet, unyielding, non-combative love.